All right. Hey, everybody. I see folks jumping in. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Thanks, everybody, for joining us from wherever you're at. Certainly hoping that you're safe and well, and as are your family and elders and colleagues and friends. If you would, we are grateful to have Joanne Krell from Defy Communications, former vice chair of the Communications Network Board, also worked at General Motors as the executive director of corporate communications, and before that was vice president for communications or vice president of communications, excuse me, at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. She's presently the co-founder and managing partner or co-managing partner at Defy Communications based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She's going to be with us in just a quick minute to talk to us about leadership communications. So hopefully that's why you're here. Got the URL and are with us. If you would, if you've been with the network before, go ahead and take your finger or cursor, whatever you're using, go down and you should see that this Zoom thingamabobby has a chat function down in the lower right-hand corner. Click on that. And if you would, go ahead and add your name, where you're located, what organization you're representing into the chat. We'll all just get a chance to say hello to one another, get connected. I think that's really, really important right now. We also, as you probably have noticed, have a Q&A box. You'll see that down, also down at the bottom there. And that's where you're going to put your questions for Joanne. Hey, everybody. Oh, my goodness. Dennis, Karen, Jack, Phil, I can't even go through it, folks. We had almost 800 people sign up for this thing. So maybe that's the other thing to add. If you're connecting to this and a colleague is as well, it's worth you noting we have room for 500 folks. So if you find yourself or a colleague is messaging you and saying, I'm blocked out, we're at capacity. We are going to make a recording of this. We are posting these up as quickly as we can. Give us a little bit, maybe 24 hours, and we'll get these up live for you. Hey, Ann, hey, Jean, Eli, Bridget, Jenna. Suffice to say, we will have this all up live and available for you on comnetwork.org in short order. We are also, as we always do with these things, we are making live notes on Twitter. Our colleague Gab Sarah Ferris is manning that for us. So if you're on Twitter and you're one of those people who can manage multiple screens, join us there. The hashtag is ComNetLive. That's COMNETLIVE. You can also find information that we're sharing across the social sector. People are using the hashtag Comms for Good. That's COMMS, the number 4, GOOD. Comms for Good is a great way to find examples of work that people are doing, or maybe you can share something that you've done yourself. All right, Kristen, if you would go ahead, my friend Tristan Mahabir, my colleague, is manning the slides for us today. So I want to start actually, and this is where I have to kind of change my tone because I have to share some bad news with you folks, or some very, very sad news. Our friend Marlo Stoudemeyer, who, if you live in the Detroit region, recently presented, not so recently, just want to caution everybody, back in December of 2019, Marlo was with us presenting at the ComNetwork local group up in Detroit. The Detroit group hosted him. Marlo passed away yesterday from complications related to COVID-19. He was 43 years old and leaves behind 2 kids. And that's just tough to have to share with you. It's not a happy thing. I'm afraid we might have to talk about this a little bit more over the coming days. Our hearts go out to Marlo and his family and everybody in the Detroit community, and especially the ComNetwork local group in Detroit, Jack and Krista and Natalie and all the other folks there. This is tough news. With that, I'm going to go ahead, and I'm sorry to do it under these circumstances, but pass it on to my good friend and mentor and colleague, Joanne Krell, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how we can all serve our communities in really effective ways in the coming days when news like this continues to come at us, probably with greater acceleration. So buckle up, hang with us, and we'll take your questions at the end. So thank you, Joanne. Take it away.
Thank you, Sean, and I appreciate the introduction and being here to talk about leadership communications in a crisis, and particularly how your values can help guide you through it. And it's a heartbreak about Marlo and just a devastating situation everywhere. So let's turn and dig in together on letting your values guide you through a crisis. On the agenda, thanks, Tristan, we are, first of all, this is a really difficult and unusual time. Never before have we faced a crisis quite like this one. And the roles that we play as communicators are central to helping our organization get through this period. It's also one thing to be working on this and doing all the things and thinking that support your organization outside of the crisis, and another to be doing that while personally affected, as we just saw. And this crisis will get bigger, but even at this level, you're working remotely, you're facing new things that you haven't faced before, chances are good we will feel the effects of this personally more and more each day. So while we can, it's a good time for us to get on solid footing with how we can help our leaders and our organizations, those we support and those we count on, how we can help them all get through this crisis. Today, we're going to talk about what's important when communicating now, what people need, and how we'll help deliver that, and how to ride out this storm. And here's a spoiler alert. You can count on hearing listening more, communicating early and often with transparency and compassion. Those are going to be the things that guide us through this time. I've got some advice for leaders that you as communicators can give to them, some best practices, and why having and owning the narrative is really important. And we'll touch on the opportunities that are born from crisis. So let's go forward and talk about why COVID-19 is so different. You know, for better or for worse, working in big organizations and institutions has given me a seat, and I imagine the same is true for many of you, at the table for some pretty dramatic crises. Plane crashes, plant closings, major multinational company bankruptcy, hostile takeovers, organizational theft and crime are just a few of the ones that I've had a seat at. And they all shared a relatively common arc. There was a beginning, there was an end, and in between, there was a need to get the facts, communicate the ugliness, apologize, put a rectification plan in place, and prove you were walking the talk. But with COVID-19, we're dealing with a truly unprecedented situation. It's hard to imagine that any of us have seen anything quite like this. Even those of you that routinely work on major global health crises probably haven't had the magnitude of this problem along with the simultaneous personal threat. This is really different. And as we've seen, the disruption to millions of people's lives, the fear and discomfort, and the economic damage is already significant. And the loss of human life is, of course, devastating. So unlike other crises that organizations experience, it's not based on something an organization did, and at the same time, it's impacting all of us, more so than 9/11 or the global economic collapse. Because of that, we're wise to behave differently. There's no predefined crisis plan that we can use. We'll have to rely on both the heart and the head, behaviors and mindsets. And these behaviors and mindsets will keep us from chasing what we heard in favor of focusing on what we believe in and where we're going. Next slide. Thank you. You know, how we behave in a crisis is really important. Leaders are under enormous pressure. They feel a huge responsibility for their employees, for their grantees, their investees, their donors, the communities in which they work, and to their boards. Who knows what major things were already on their plates, what weights they were carrying before this hit, but now everything is that much heavier, that much more difficult. And at the same time, they're living this too. Their parents, their siblings, their children, their friends, and they are relied on by many people. Some of our leaders have had a great deal of experience dealing with crises, large and small. But for others, that's just simply not the case. This is a completely new experience. So number one, communicating is a must. Early, often, calmly, transparently, and with compassion, and with a hopeful and optimistic lens on the future. And listening to learn and to maybe what you don't want to hear are essential. So for communicators, what your organization believes and the actions it takes are really the primary elements that you have to deal with, that you have to work with. But it is also true that you can play a critical role helping to shape the decisions that are getting made. You bring your knowledge of constituents, both internal and external, the landscape, and your ability to gather information and share it in a way that influences outcomes. In this way, you can lead from the side. And how we behave in this pandemic can and should be linked to our organizational values. And here's why. Probably every person on this call has spent lots of time lots of effort and lots of the organization's money on defining your mission, your values, and your vision. These values define who you are and how you will behave in the world. And if there's anything I'd want you to take away from our conversation today, it's that it's your values that you can and should always return to define your actions, guide your judgments, and lead your behaviors. They were most likely developed when you weren't in any kind of a crisis, and they probably have great consensus within your organization. So these can be inordinately helpful, keeping you centered and keeping your messages focused. So let's talk about where we should focus. I don't know about you, but I have seen some incredible examples of excellent communications already. Really beautiful, heartfelt, clear letters about the coronavirus, tips for how to manage, excellent language about flattening the curve, washing hands, and keeping socially distant while socially connected. I just don't know if I also need to hear that though from Bell Tire and my local juice bar. This isn't a time for brand building. It's a time for everyone to play their position well. So to that end, I would say focus your communications on those who are looking to you for critical information. For certain, that's employees first. Internal communications is really the most important for information, for morale, for trust. But up next, grantees, investees, if you're an impact investing organization, donors, partners, communities, boards, contractors, you are a primary and trusted source for them, and they're looking to you for information. So provide that to them and give them assurance, connection, and encouragement. You know, people in the social sector are so good about meeting people where they are. I'm certain actually that it is this sector that realized the criticality of that first. But with real and heightened vulnerabilities, meeting people where they are is essential. So once you're clear about your audiences, then you can use the communication strategies, tools, and tactics that you often rely upon and that are most appropriate to the situation. If you have stories to tell that can help others, by sharing key information on how you're granting and decisions you're making, particularly true at the community level, but at other levels as well, if these could be helpful for replication in other communities or with other funders, then by all means, take your storytelling public. I want to turn and talk about what we specifically can do as communicators during this time. So Tristan, if we could go to the next slide. I imagine many of you have this in place already, but if not, probably the single most important thing that you could do to help your organization right now is put a crisis communications team in place. You need a central group to make decisions and to direct communications and to take the pressure off the rest of the organization so that everyone else can focus on the work at hand. This is definitely not a time to let the speed of information outrun your ability to make decisions. This team shouldn't be too big. It should be a handful of people, a dedicated crisis leader, the head of HR, the head of comms, someone who represents the core business like programming. And this group should report to the CEO. You should meet regularly, every day, probably first of the day and last of the day. Should identify who's responsible for what. For communicators, that could be bringing information to the meetings, have a recommended and first draft of the days or weeks communications to different constituents and when they should go. You all as a team should commit to frequent communications. You should identify responsibilities that different groups in the organization will take on in the crisis. You should be the primary source of information about what the organization is doing. You should commit to listening and to developing and to communicating calmly, transparently, compassionately, and confidently. And I would recommend that you develop a rapid response process in place to respond to rumors and to realities. Determine how you'll manage when the crisis hits close to home, keeping in mind privacy considerations. As things ramp up and get more intense, This team serves a really critical role in helping the organization survive and move past the day-to-day flashpoints. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you, Tristan. As communicators, there's a number of things that we can do, but one of the most important is to help your leadership see the criticality of internal communications and prioritizing employee audiences. And in the social sector, that's not always the first place that institutions put their attention. But in this time, it really is important. The Gallup organization says that a key predictor of low worry and high confidence is whether each employee believes and experiences that the organization is looking out for their best interest. Regular communications go a long way to helping people feel assured, connected, and encouraged. And finding ways to hear from employees is equally important as speaking to them. You could do one-to-one calls from leaders to employees. You could set up a buddy system, connecting more seasoned employees with newer ones. You could create small groups via Zoom to have coffee chats between leaders and staffers. The important thing is to listen, sometimes to things that are difficult and painful to hear. And also, when you have a sense of the morale, you can, if the opportunity is available to you, put into practice some boosters. For some organizations, that will be a membership to Calm. For others, it could be using virtual dance party to open a meeting or put a break into the meeting. You can share resources for kids and for cooking, for pets and for conference calls. You might think about standing up a private face group page or an Instagram channel for your organization to have social time. Whatever channels your organization uses for internal communications are the best ones to use now. Your communications outbound should be in highly visible places. It's also true that organizations are no doubt making really difficult decisions. Don't shy away from explaining them. Within the limits that you might need to follow, explain how you made them and why. And as often as is reasonable, reassure people. Even if the news is bad now, there will be a time when it gets better, and that message delivered with confidence needs to be part of the message framework. A dose of optimism is vital. By encouraging and connecting and reassuring people, what you're really doing is empowering them to make the best decisions possible at a really difficult time. Next slide. After you focus on employees, the next most important audience is your primary stakeholders. That could be grantees, it could be funders, it could be investees, but no matter who this audience is, it has to be, your communications has to be about them. Again, honesty and transparency rule the day here. As hard as it can be to share what is changing, you owe it to them to do that. And there may be ways that they can help you see another solution. Communicate what you need and what you're doing, and offer ideas for how to get through this crisis. Communicators can play a vital role by having their finger on the pulse through networks and stories, and can share those with leadership and across the organization. And keep in mind, a good idea can come from anywhere. So be listening for where you can help shape and influence decisions. Next slide. As we continue to go through this period of time, there will very likely be another wave to this crisis. And this time, it could be a lot harder. Now, I know yesterday, a lot of us heard that when the Easter Bunny arrives in a couple of weeks, this crisis might very well be over. But I'm not sure most of us believe that's true. So have a plan in place for your communications team in how you would react if things do start getting tough in your organization, if people do start getting sick or worse. Be helping the organization get ready for crises that haven't hit yet. Contingency plans are excellent to have in place. The crisis team may have developed a rapid response plan, but you'll want a way for media to be able to connect with the organization and to know who to go to and how. And again, keep in mind privacy considerations. This is going to become more important as different scenarios present, and not all of them have been foreseen. So know that you need to be agile and nimble and have a number 2 team in place that can step up as people, even if they're well, they're going to be tired. They're going to be fatigued from the crisis process. It takes its toll after a while. And you need to bring fresh blood into the process and cycle out people who are showing effects of wearing. Next slide, please. Gallup recently conducted a poll on leadership communications. It was really interesting. It showed that global citizens look to leaders to provide a path and to provide confidence that there's a way forward that they can contribute to. Human nature dictates that people respond to crisis in one of 2 ways. They either sort of turtle up and kind of get caught up in fear, victimization, or helplessness, completely understandable in this day. Or some people really blossom. They feel self-actualized. It leads to greater engagement. They're their best in a crisis. But no matter which group of people you're dealing with, or likely both of them, people have 4 universal needs from their leaders. They need trust, they need compassion, they need stability, and they need hope. So to help facilitate that, I want to share some advice that you could share with your leaders. You know, as a communications team, people will be looking for you to how to manage this situation and what to say and what to do and what not to do. And you don't need to be the chief communicator to be relied upon. Frankly, it's ideal if the communications team speaks with a unified voice about what's important. So spend some time with your fellow communicators, making sure that you all have messages and approaches that are aligned and agreed to. Here are a few things that matter most as you give advice to your leadership. Leadership starts from the top, but it's not command and control. In fact, leaders of every team and function will likely want to communicate, and they should. And you can help them bring clarity, compassion, empathy, and optimism to their communications. And you can also help them be concise. Communication is like oxygen for leaders, and everyone needs to be doing a lot of deep breathing right now. Leaders at every level need to be visible. Despite the dual hardship they carry of leading through a crisis while they're in it themselves, they have to be available and accessible to their teams. But since there's no leadership by walking around, a really nice way to connect is to have leaders share the responsibility of checking in with everyone in the organization by phone or Zoom. Balance the heart and the head, but in this case, the heart leads. Start with empathy and compassion. And while I don't think it's hard for leaders to do that, I think they're really quite good, particularly in this sector, at starting from a place of empathy and compassion. They might not be so great about accepting empathy. As one global management consulting expert says, as stress, fatigue, and uncertainty build up during a crisis, leaders might find that their abilities to process information, to remain level-headed, and to exercise good judgment diminish. They'll stand a better chance of countering functional declines if they encourage colleagues to express concern and heed the warnings they're given. Investing time in their well-being will enable leaders to sustain their effectiveness over the weeks and the months that a crisis can entail. People also need an outlet to share their thoughts with leadership and with their peers. There are a ton of good ideas for creating a greater sense of community and camaraderie. Here are a couple of ones that I like. Gather for coffee chats and shared lunches. Take a walk outside while chatting with a colleague by phone. Phone call to folks on your team to ask them how they're doing or hear what's on their mind or supports their efforts. It's time well spent. Bring your kids, your partners, and your pets to work by remote. At some point, it's probably unavoidable, and I know that I have read a number of very funny stories about people unavoidably showcasing their family. So maybe create a bespoke meeting to create that familiarity. And you might also want to create a private Facebook group or stand up an Instagram channel for your organization to communicate, share photos, and just have some fun. As a leader, if you don't tell your organization's story, somebody else will. So be really careful about that. Gossip and rumor can fill in when there's fear. Even if you don't have every fact and every contingency, and you won't, it's much better for you to communicate what you can and be honest where you don't have answers. If you stay ahead by communicating clearly and frequently, it doesn't allow for an absence to be filled by somebody else. Tell people how you've come to the decisions you've made. Again, your organization values are the guideposts for those decisions, so lean on them. Share information widely and in highly visible ways. And if you have an intranet, it's a perfect tool to use now. You might need to resend a password reset to everyone and maybe offer a tutorial on how to use it if it's not a frequented channel, but that's time well spent. Use what you've got. So early, when I first started talking to you all, I talked about this notion of leading from the side. And at Defy, we talk about leading from the side quite a bit. It's a recognition that communicators have a leadership role to play in service to the organization. It means that you don't get out in front of the organization, but you also can't lag behind. You want to be there for takeoff and touchdown. It's based on relationships and agility, knowledge and know-how. And as a communicator, you can influence and shape the direction of the organization. So here's some best practices for leading from the side in a crisis. First, bring a keen sense of the landscape, facts and data, an understanding of how different constituents are feeling, a sense of where opportunity exists, a strong connection to the organization's values, and ways to help shape decisions based on knowledge and acumen. Be a reliable source of information, but never freelance it. I cannot overemphasize how important it is not to make guesses at this time. Be accessible and be flexible. Honor and maintain confidentiality, also super critical. You either have information that others don't, or people think you do. Either way, perception is reality. Don't try to correct the record on something if the information you have is still confidential. Instead, having heard rumor or wrong information, share it with the crisis team and make it an urgent item to address through an official communication. Act as a dual advocate. You represent the outside world in, and you represent the inside world out. There's few people in your organization who have a better sense of constituents and how they're thinking and feeling in crises than you. You always have an audience focus, and that is so important as a top flight communicator. And lastly, anticipate and navigate. This is going to be, actually, anticipation and navigation will follow you through everything that you do in communications, but now more than ever, pay attention to what's going on outside of your organization and see where it can be useful to what's going on inside of your organization. You know, as communicators, we frequently obsess over narratives. What's the story? How are we going to tell it? How are we going to use our influence to move the narrative? How can we own the day? Because this situation doesn't look like it will abate anytime soon. And we know that in the social sector, we often feel lagging effects of the economy. It is really important for you to establish a narrative now. Help your leadership take control of the narrative. Help them be clear about current realities, what you don't know, what you believe the positive picture can be when this whole experience ends. Leaders that stay connected to the people they support will do a great service for others and be rewarded with a stronger relationship going forward. I urge you to make that a high priority in your communications approach. And finally, I just want to say this. We've all heard many times that in crisis there is opportunity. It is absolutely true. Undoubtedly, we're going to learn a lot from this crisis. Business will very likely change. There are so many opportunities to learn, to sense, and to respond, and to see new ways of doing old things. I believe we'll change how we work. We'll value our time differently. We may see employees and internal communications and culture as far more vital to our overall functioning and the importance of connecting with one another in authentic ways. Communicators far too often, and for reasons that have long confounded me, are misunderstood in their organizations. But now we have an opportunity to play a pivotal role in helping organizations not just survive this crisis, but come out of the other side stronger. Your strategic thinking, your calm under pressure, your ability to translate the complex into the meaningful and easy, your innovative ideas and approaches are opportunities to build understanding for the strategic nature, value, and contributions of communications. Now, this morning I received a note that included this story that I'd like to share. In the 17th century, the Great Plague of London sent Isaac Newton, then in his 20s, back home from Trinity College in Cambridge to the family estate. While there for a year, he did some of his best work in mathematics and his study of gravity. And this reminds us that while the natural tendency of many may be to, quote, just survive, the innovators will thrive. If Sir Isaac Newton's remote work produced such genius then, and given what we're seeing in the world's unique experiment now, who knows what great things will happen as organizations reconsider culture and how work gets done. So that's all for me. I'd love to take questions and hear what's on your mind. Thanks so much.
All right, we have a bunch of questions. There's about 500 of us in the room. So if you have questions, and Alan and Christian, I saw you just put some in the chat. I'm not trying to call you all out, but if you wouldn't mind, put those in the Q&A box. That's where I'm looking. Piper has a question that a lot of you want to know. Will we send out this PowerPoint after the event? Yeah, absolutely, we will. We will be sharing a video of this, and we will put the slides up on comnetwork.org, probably within the next 24 hours, and we will make sure to share that out on social as well. So by all means, you will see that and be our guest. Please do share that if it's helpful to anybody. That's time well spent, I think, from our perspective. Someone who decided to go anonymous, come on, we're all friends here, asked, given the market collapse and tremendous economic uncertainty, should not-for-profit foundations be hitting the pause button on fundraising activities? A lot of people want to know the answer to that. Joanne, what do you say? Should we pause on the asks right now if you're a not-for-profit organization?
You may not be able to, is kind of the answer. Look, people are going to do what they can. What I personally am seeing is that fundraising is going hyper local. I was shocked to see and pleasantly surprised and happy to participate in the local bookstore in my Ann Arbor neighborhood did a GoFundMe because they're at risk of going out of business, and they are a much loved business in this town. And very quickly they raised, when I last saw it last night, it was around $75,000. They were looking to raise 100, and they started in the morning. And I'm going to guess they made their goal. So I think people are focused hyper locally, but I don't think you're in a position to stop your work. I think you have to be more thoughtful about how it's done. And the repetitive nature of it might need an adjustment, and the messaging for it might need an adjustment. There has to be a recognition that there is a crisis going on, but you may not be able to stop your fundraising efforts if it puts the work that you do supporting people and animals at risk.
Okay, next question comes from our friend Doretta, who asks, how can smaller organizations establish a crisis communications team? Can this be part of our existing leadership?
You know, it can be part of your existing leadership, but I worry that people have too many things on their plate and won't have enough distance to be able to manage the crisis. You don't have to have the title of chief to be on a crisis team, although somebody from the C-suite, somebody from the executive level should be on it. But you can have other people in it and playing that role. I think you need a team that basically has a ring fence around them and is somewhat protected from doing their normal day job, particularly in the beginning, because there are a lot of demands. And you need people who are fresh and not overly fatigued by trying to do everything at once. So I don't think your whole leadership team should do it. I do think you should appoint a separate team. It doesn't need to be that big, but it does need to be focused.
Okay, next question comes from our friend Piper. How do you focus on the mission of your organization as you're communicating about the virus, really ensuring that your message is specific to the mission of your organization? So maybe just give you an example, Joanne. You're Chad Nelson, you're the CEO of the Surfrider Foundation. Most days you're thinking about ocean conservation. How do you talk to folks in light of the fact that the world is talking about COVID-19?
Look, we're going to come out of this. if we don't, none of this really will matter. So we are going to come out of this. We're going to be probably working differently and doing different things. So it pays to be innovative now. But I don't think that you can stop the work that you're doing. I do think you have to be cognizant of really important flashpoints in the system. So if this were Lombardy, Italy, and you were seeing 600 or 700 deaths a day, you might need to do a little bit of pausing, but I don't think you're going to be able to back off of your work. You might need to get out with different messages, different innovative ideas in how you are supporting the health of the nation, supporting the climate, doing things that allow us to be able to live our lives. Just like the idea that a crisis team helps an organization be able to manage a crisis while still moving forward in their work, institutions have to still be able to move forward in their work while health groups and government groups are managing crisis. So I wouldn't abandon what you're doing. I would just move more thoughtfully with messaging and not pretend that something isn't going on. I think you have to work with the lens that there is very much a crisis going on, and yet we have to save our oceans. We have to address reforestation. We have to provide for the most vulnerable among us. So I don't think you can stop what you're doing. You have to stay mission focused, but you have to take a slightly different approach.
And I might just in the spirit of yes, and I think
Yes.
it's also really essential for everybody to be keeping in mind one of the challenges that we're facing, because this is an asymmetrical crisis. What it feels like in New York City is probably feeling a little bit different than it might be feeling like in Taos, New Mexico. I think it's really essential that one of the things we can all do, we've talked about this a little bit before over the last couple of weeks, is offer a signal boost. And what that means is amplifying the CDC, the NIH, and to the extent that you can, get in touch with your local health departments or just pull information from them because they're awfully busy right now. But we're all getting information from lots of different vectors. It's a much more crowded information space than we were in maybe 10 years ago. And so your organization's voice as a trusted steward or member of your community can be really helpful. And you may not realize you may be the one that puts somebody in contact with information that saves a life. That's really an essential piece of work that you should be doing, as well as finding ways to help people. We sent out with this invitation an example. The California Healthcare Foundation out there in Oakland has made it on their webpage now several links to what they're calling external resources, which is links to the CDC. Yep. And the local California State Department of Health. If that ends up helping just 2 people get information that they need, that is incredibly helpful. We're a networked world right now. So I think a piece of the responsibility we all carry is to make sure that we're helping other people get the word out. Does that sound right to you, Joanne?
For sure. I really agree. And also in the areas that are less hard hit, if you are targeting your communications as a nonprofit organization, those might be more fertile grounds for you to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, next question coming in says, excuse me again, a great many of the questions that we're fielding are about what will happen in June or in July or August. Obviously, we don't know. And we have to keep saying, we just don't know. No one knows. Is there any advice that you might have, Joanne, for a more skillful response?
I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but the one thing you could do is you could set a date for which we will give you an answer on this date. Sometimes a little more specificity helps lower the temperature a bit. So if you can say, here are the 3 or 4 things we commit to do between now and X date, and you can check here for updates on our website, or we'll communicate with you this way. I think in the realm of reaching out to people, when they hear from you, they feel a little better. It doesn't mean that their questions go away. There are just too many unknowns, but you can tell them, here's what we're doing. We're evaluating whether or not we can keep this on the schedule. If we do, we'll know by this date. We'll tell you then. We will have a news update out that will address the following things. And if it turns out that we have to make a change, if we decide to postpone, we'll let you know that. But if we decide to use a different methodology to keep the meeting going or something, we'll let you know how you can participate and what it means for you. And if you've done a deposit, we'll let you know when you're getting that back, or what all the details are. But I think identify a date certain by which you can tell them, and give them 3 or 4 things that you're going to tell them, and then be good to your word and do that.
Derek asks, Joanne, you mentioned several organizations that were doing a really great job of communicating during this crisis. Can you please provide some specific examples?
I was afraid I was going to get that question when I said that. I should have been ready for that one. I think I've seen a number of funders who have communicated proactively about what they're doing. I happen to have seen the Hilton Foundation's communication about how they were going to fund going forward. I've seen Starbucks's outreach that I thought was really quite nice. There's just been a number. I'd be happy to come back with a sheet of resources of things that I've seen that I thought were really good examples. But the thing that has struck me is how good the tone has been, and how much is open source right now. So I will come back with a few resources that could help give you some language options and some ideas as you do your own communications.
And again, in the spirit of yes, and if you're not aware, the network has actually created an open source or collaborative document and Google Sheet that you can find on comnetwork.org. The open source doc is giving you kind of a very brief primer on how to communicate, just the very basics, mostly the stuff you know, but maybe it could be helpful to the boss. The sheet is literally a collection of, and y'all are just amazing. It's incredible how kind and generous people are being in the middle of what is kind of a maelstrom. Folks have been posting up examples of the communications they've been putting out. So if you're looking for examples, you can go to comnetwork.org and take a look at the Google Sheet, where you will find examples. And I think, I don't know if I have the right to decree this, but I think the rules around plagiarism are kind of off. If you need to grab some language in order to be efficient and effective, I don't think anyone's going to come chasing after you, as long as you, at some point, maybe send a note to the person who drafted and say, you did me a solid. Thank you so much. I borrowed some of your language. We used it in this way, and it was really helpful. But suffice to say, you can find examples of work. And it's also the team, Yabby and Carrie, did a wonderful job. They actually organized it so you can get a sense of whether it's an event cancellation, whether it's a message to grantees, so you can actually search for exactly what you might need. You can find that again at comnetwork.org. Nina asks, Joanne, is it best to stop all normal communications to external audiences, or is it okay to talk about the regular work of our organization during COVID?
I think it's okay to talk about the regular work as long as you're sensitive to what could be conceived as inappropriate. And only you would know if there was something in a local environment where maybe you shouldn't comment on something. But work has to go on. I mean, this is a crisis, but it's going to pass. And people need to be engaged in the work that they're doing. Otherwise, we're just going to be in a complete standstill. So you'll have to make some choices, but by and large, you shouldn't stop what you're doing. You should keep the engine of productivity going. And people need that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would add that to Joanne's point about this being a time of an opportunity for innovation, I don't mean to sound crass, but if you think about a crisis that was sort of on the scale, maybe it was 9/11. And coming out of 9/11, we set a whole bunch of new narratives. We told ourselves a bunch of stories that shaped the way our society has evolved over the last 20 years or so, including just whole new industries emerged. Homeland security industry. The police department in Topeka, Kansas has a tank now. We've militarized the police. There were a bunch of narratives that emerged out of 9/11. Many of them maybe not so good. I'll reserve judgment there. But suffice to say, this is an opportunity for us to maybe reset as a society, maybe even as a globe. So be mindful that that's happening, whether we like it or not. You can certainly play a role there in some meaningful ways. David asks a question here, Joanne. He says, my team is prone to perfectionism. Nothing about that in ordinary times, but now it seems to have kicked up a notch. How do you balance making things as good as they can be while also being fast and nimble and juggling a larger workload than normal? I feel like my team sometimes wastes time and energy on things that don't matter in the large scheme of a global crisis. What's your advice?
Yeah, I think your instinct is completely right. For one, we should not let perfect be the enemy of really good, and stuff's got to get out the door. And so if you deliver, the perfect document, but it's a day late, the door could be shut. So don't do that. do the best work you can do and get it out there. We've got to make progress, and you can't make progress if you're constantly niff-gnawing over every little detail in it.
Okay, next question. Joanne, how do we communicate to the staff that there may be pay cuts, layoffs, and benefit cuts due to financial uncertainty in the midst of a health crisis?
Yeah, that's a miserable experience that I've been through before. This is one of these times where earlier in the presentation part, I said, like, essentially fill your bucket before somebody else does. If that could happen as quickly as possible, once that decision is made, communicate it. Be clear, tell them why, tell them what you're doing, and tell them that if this is the truth, tell them that you hope that after a certain period of time, when things level back off, benefits will be restored, salaries will be restored. I mean, oftentimes that does happen. At one point in my earlier GM career, right before the global economic collapse, salaries were cut and people were not happy and benefits were cut. And that had been coming for a long time. And 401k was being cut, the match was gone. At the end of the day, having a job is really important. And so that's sort of number one. The leadership is probably doing everything it possibly can to protect the organization from having to take too much of a haircut. So communicate quickly, be transparent about why the decision had to be made, be clear that other things will, there won't be discretionary spending, so that you won't be looking at like, oh, why are we spending all our money on this retirement party while our salaries are being cut? You have to get really careful about the decisions that you make and the judgments that you make, but explain it. Probably explain in detail how much salaries and benefits are of the overall budget, and that the only way to stay afloat is to take this kind of a cut, and the sacrifice is shared. It's really important that the leadership also has sacrifices to an equal or greater level than the rest of the organization. But be clear, be fast, and let people know what it would take for salaries and benefits to be restored. Don't let this linger for a long time in the ether without addressing it.
And just in the spirit to add on to that, just in the spirit of trying to be helpful, an organization has recently been through something kind of like this, and that's the United States government, when they had the government shut down I believe it was just a year ago. So you may take some lessons there for what it's worth. I know, for instance, personally in our family, my wife works for the Environmental Protection Agency, and everyone within that agency decided to donate a day a week, that they would work without pay for a day. And in order to do that, they did that because leadership was transparent. So we're gonna have to cut jobs. Rather than seeing a head count cut, everybody decided to what they call donate a day. So there's some solutions out there if we go looking for them, maybe outside of our sector. Next question. Ooh, this one's gonna be a doozy, Joanne. Good luck with this one. Any recommendations on how to curb leadership that isn't staying on message? So an example here, the HR or chief financial officer doesn't agree with decisions being made and counters what the CEO is communicating. What do you do?
Meaning that person is going off with one level of messaging and the CEO is going off with
I believe so, yeah. So you have CEO saying one thing on the one hand, it's a left-hand, right-hand problem. Yeah. And CFO is saying something else.
Ultimately, it is the CEO's responsibility to get his and her direct reports aligned on the message. And I think the chief communications officer has to talk to the CEO about that and talk about what the risks are to the organization of mixed messaging anytime, but especially during a heightened time like this. It is very unhelpful to have two leaders saying different things.
Okay, Bill asks, Joanne, any advice for small organizations? These are fewer than 10 people on staff, and the concept of team and the ability to share the load within these kinds of organizations where they're just smaller, it's just necessarily different. How do you manage that? Any special advice there?
I can imagine how hard that is for a teeny organization, and Defy is a small firm, so I know what that is like. But I think you have to be super transparent with your colleagues about what's at play, what's at stake, and how you're going to divide and conquer certain things. I think that's really the only thing you can do, since not everybody can be in on everything. On the flip side, there's not so many people to communicate to that it isn't doable. So I think just really good partnership and making sure that you guys have time for connection, and for encouraging one another, and ways to breathe within your organization. Small organizations really have to manage a lot, and just making sure that you have really great intra communications will help you get through this time more easily.
Allison has a great question. A lot of folks interested in the answer to this one, and it is, Joanne, how do we tell stories of clients who are going to be hit hardest by all of this? Those who are living in poverty, they're going to be falling further into poverty while not walking away from ethical storytelling. Should we paint a picture of their real life realities, even if we're not able to point to immediate successes or solutions?
You're trying to save lives out there. You need to lift up the lived experiences of people in vulnerable communities. They cannot be silenced at this time. So I think you're in for some maybe more raw storytelling, but it has to happen now. You have to shine a light on those experiences in order to make change for them. After all, big corporations are going to get bailed out with billions of dollars, and you have to try to bring some balance to this picture and tell the stories of people who are suffering.
Okay, Sheldon asks a question, as an advocacy organization, so they're doing advocacy work, how can you keep the organization's mission front and center without looking like you're taking advantage of the crisis?
Let me think about that for a second. Look, I don't know that you would be taking advantage of the crisis if your organization's mission is to help people who are in a difficult position. You have to tell their stories. I think you have to do it, though, in a way that doesn't take advantage of people. You can't be exploitive. You've got to focus on those closest to you and make sure that you're highlighting the issues and the opportunities that exist for these people, but don't do it in a way that, not that I think that you would, but don't do it in a way that exploits them. As this crisis goes on, we're going to risk losing more people and having more people suffer. So if your mission is central to what is going on in this world, you have to tell those stories. You have to lift up people with lived experiences and make sure that that storytelling is happening, but not in a way that's exploitative.
And humble brag here, if you all need some resources on storytelling, we have a number of them. If you go to storytelling.comnetwork.org, you'll find a website we created with our friends from Rockefeller and Hathaway Group called Storytelling for Good. So a really nice primer, good information there for folks who are interested in doing some storytelling. And we'll share that link in the chat. Also, you should know our friend Carrie from the network team has put the links to that Google Doc and sheet that I mentioned earlier in the chat. So you can find those links just there. Joanne, this is the $100,000 question of the day. How do you balance being honest about the hard facts and scaring your audience?
Well, how do you do it? You put out there what is most important in order to address the audiences that you care, the populations that you care most about. And again, I think you have to lift up people with lived experiences, but you cannot exploit them. So there is a line, and I think you sort of know when you cross over it, that you have to get the facts out there and you have to tell stories in a way that are compelling, but you have to do it in a way that's respectful to the communities in which you're trying to, help. I hope that answers your question. I suspect there's a real concern that there's honesty taking place, and that you're talking to employees in a way that feels legitimate and honest. And I think above all else, you have to treat people respectfully and making sure you're being honest and transparent and compassionate. And in that compassion, not stepping over the line to exploiting people in order to take advantage of where their heartstrings are at the moment.
Okay, Sarah has a question. A lot of folks interested in the answer to this one as well, Joanne. Everyone is sending out emails. I know we're doing that at the network. Is there a time where we shouldn't send out another email for the sake of not overwhelming people's inboxes?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think you have to only speak to the people who are closest to you and are looking to you for assurance or connection or encouragement or information. It's kind of sometimes I do get emails from organizations, and I think to myself, why are you telling me? You know, why Bell Tire are you telling me about how to wash my hands? I know I bought tires from you at one point, but this isn't really helpful to me. And so there's a line between not overwhelming people and being really thoughtful. You know, by the volume of emails that are going into your own email boxes, just how much people can take. It's definitely not a time for brand building. It just really isn't. I mean, reputation will accrue to the organizations that acted appropriately in this time. And so there is a level of restraint that is necessary. So don't overwhelm people by coming at them too often. If you have information that they need or encouragement that you know that they will benefit from, or connection that will help get them through this time, I think those are good pillars to live by. But know who is your audience and who isn't, and don't go out widely to everyone when that's not appropriate.
Our friend Marcus down in Texas asks, Joanne, what are some of the tools that orgs are using to help employees talk to leadership, to be in touch? Aside from email, you'd mentioned Facebook groups. Are there others that you like?
Great question. I'm glad you asked that. Yes, messaging tools are really helpful during this time. Slack and Shanty. There's one called Matters Most that has a higher privacy filter if that's important in your organization. Zoom obviously has probably never been busier or more popular. The telephone, the good old fashioned telephone, is just a nice way to connect with people. Your intranet site, if you have one, is great. Any kinds of tools like that can really help facilitate communication within your organization and among people.
Okay, we're almost up at the top of the hour. Are you okay for time? We have a lot more questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all just because we got 30 questions in the queue, gang. But can we borrow another 5 minutes of your time? Would that be all right?
I have a hard stop at 3. I'm sorry
Do.
to say.
Okay. All right. Well, then I tell you what, Joanne has shared her email and we will post it into the chat so you can follow up with her. You can also find, we posted in the invitation her Twitter, which is at Libsy, Libsy. So if you tweet at her, she may be a little busy just this minute, but can I make this promise on your behalf? She will get back in touch with you.
Absolutely. I'd be delighted to connect. And either on Twitter or LinkedIn or by email, joanne.krell@defycommunications.com. And happy to be helpful wherever I can be. And I really appreciate the time and opportunity to talk about leadership communications with you.
And just on behalf of everybody, Joanne, we had 500 folks in the room and probably a few folks got locked out. So I'm sorry about that. But on behalf of everybody, you are amazing. Thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful. To everybody else, come back and join us on Friday. George Strait, the former chief medical correspondent or health correspondent at ABC News, will be with us to talk about how we can consume media in the next couple of days. We'll be back Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, so I hope you all can join us. We will be making a recording of this available, and any links, we'll share those on comnetwork.org. Again, Joanne, thank you so much. You've done a lot of good for a lot of people. We're all grateful, and of course, at the network, we're all grateful to all of you out there in the community for the good work you're doing. Hang in there, if you will, gang. And again, to our friends in Detroit, just our deepest sympathies to you with the loss of Mr. Stoudemeyer. That's just a really tough one to hear, and unfortunately probably an indication of the kinds of things that are coming our way in the days to come. But we can get through this together, and we will. There is going to be another side to this. So thanks, everybody. Be well, and we'll be back with you Friday afternoon. Joanne, thank you again, my friend.
Be well. Bye-bye.